Missouri to the Final Four? Well, that's where they're heading in my bracket. You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts. Right now, I'm Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And, well, leading up to the Drake game tomorrow, I've had a lot of Missouri fans wondering, could Bennett Stirtz, a Missouri guy, could he be on the move in the portal, possibly even to Missouri next season? Well, let's explore that possibility, of course. Talk more about that huge first-round matchup, get to the rest of my predictions in the bracket. Really quickly, I do want to remind you this episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first order. And one thing I've noticed a lot over the years is obviously the last 2 or 3 weeks or so, once the calendar flips to March in particular, well, your more casual college basketball fans start paying attention. And even hardcore fans of their own teams like Mizzou start paying attention a little bit more to the rest of the country. I know I am certainly in that camp. And one thing I've noticed over the years is there is always at least one top team that the public starts getting skeptical of. I think right now that's probably the Auburn Tigers most obviously, but also I think our Missouri Tigers are that team as well to a lesser extent than Auburn. And while champions are rarely, and I mean very rarely, surprising in the NCAA tournament, I do always like to go slightly against the grain when finding at least one Final Four participant. And you know what? I've got a couple of them this season. I'll reveal one of them later, but right now, the obvious one to me is the Missouri Tigers. And you know what? Let's bring up the bracket here because I'm going to make my case visually here. Let's go through this. So you got Missouri against Drake. Obviously, I'm going to take the Tigers as a 6.5-point favorite there. Second round against Texas Tech. Well, the thing with Texas Tech is I actually think they have a very similar profile to the Alabama Crimson Tide, whereas they're a high octane offense, maybe not as good on defense, although definitely Tech has a slower pace than Alabama does. I just think that's kind of a toss-up type of basketball game, so forgive me if I'm going to go with my team in that one. And then Sweet 16. Hey, if Missouri gets here, first of all, let's just make something really clear. If Missouri gets this as Sweet 16, that is an unbelievable great season. That is a win for Dennis Gates, his program, all the fans, without a doubt. But I think Missouri can advance even further than that in the bracket. St. John's definitely a popular pick to advance far in the tournament. But when you really look at it objectively, the Johnnies are 12th in KenPom. Missouri is 15th. Not exactly a massive chasm there. And when you look at the quality of victories, well, Missouri has beaten a lot more quality teams, higher quality teams than St. John's. Now, here is the next part where I must admit that I did cheat a little bit, because I think if I had Missouri and Florida matched up in the Elite Eight, I don't think I would have picked Missouri straight up to win. But again, now here's the beautiful moment where I, the podcaster, am able to cheat. But not really cheat, it's just I have a feeling that people, speaking of underestimating teams, I think that the Maryland Terrapins are being underestimated. As you can see here, I have Florida going down to Maryland in the round of 16. It's quite simple. Again, Maryland, a team that has a very similar profile to St. John's, a defensive-heavy type of unit that, frankly, I don't really understand why everybody loves St. John's, but they don't love Maryland. They really have a very similar profile there. So I think Maryland can possibly gum up the works and upset Florida in the round of 16, leading to a matchup with Missouri against another similar team in the Ken Palm rankings. If this plays out how I'm predicting here, well, these are going to be teams that are very similarly rated to Missouri. So none of these really are massive upsets, in my opinion. But when you get to, yes, the first Final Four in Missouri history, it was impossible for me to go too far and pick Missouri straight up against Auburn. I've long felt that Auburn was really the best team in the country, and like Missouri the last few weeks here, Auburn is not playing maybe its best basketball, and I think that's thrown a lot of national pundits off of the scent, in my opinion. Well, quite simply, I think that's overanalyzing it a little bit. I still think Auburn's the best team, and, well, if I think they're the best team, it's impossible for me to pick Missouri ahead of them. As you can see, I've got Auburn beating Duke in the national championship. And you'll also notice here on your right side of the screen, my other member of the Final Four, along with Auburn, Duke, and Missouri, is Gonzaga. And quite simply, I just think Gonzaga being an 8 seed is kind of a joke, to be honest with you. They're a top 10 caliber team, and sometimes Gonzaga's advanced stats, their net rating, whatever it might be, because they play in the West Coast Conference, just doesn't quite line up with who they are as a real team. I think Gonzaga absolutely can make a run to the Final Four, though I have to admit, Tennessee against Gonzaga in the Elite Eight, that's one I flip-flopped on quite a bit. I'll be honest, I didn't spend hours and hours breaking down this bracket or anything like that. But I like the Vols. I like Tennessee to make a run at least to the Elite Eight too. Honestly, though, I think having 3 SEC teams in my Final Four just felt like a little bit of a bridge too far. And I will say this, if it does come down, obviously a long way to go until there, but if it does happen to come down between Missouri and Florida, well, I wouldn't pick Missouri straight up against the Gators right now. I like Missouri better than most teams, more than other teams who haven't won in Gainesville. I don't think the Tigers are going to be intimidated by the Gators whatsoever, but I do think Florida certainly is playing as good a basketball as anybody in the country right now. And I will say, I do have to admit something here. As much as I try to be objective as I can with my analysis of the bracket, well, of course, my feelings are going to come in, and you know what? I want to have fun with the bracket as well. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, I'll be honest, Kansas, if I'm just looking at a blind resume, they're a team that fits the profile of a lower-seeded team that I would normally take to make a run, even to the Final Four, the Kansas Jayhawks. So you never know. Missouri truly could meet up with Kansas in the Sweet 16. I just did not want to speak that into existence. But one thing I like to look at, your AP preseason top 25. That gives you an idea. This has worked for me for years, by the way, going all the way back to Mike Miller hitting that buzzer beater in the first round, allowing Florida to advance well into, I believe, the national championship game that year, some 25 years ago or so. But that AP preseason poll will give you a great idea of teams that have really high upside that maybe haven't quite lived up to it in the body of the regular season. Well, guess what? Kansas was number 1 in the AP in the preseason. I also like teams that play defense. Jayhawks 11th on defense in the season. An experienced coach, they got it. Experienced guards, they've got them. But one thing they don't have, I don't think Kansas has upper echelon NBA talent. I just don't see it. And again, emphasis on upper echelon. I'm not talking about guys who get picked in the second round. I'm talking about more like Cooper Flagg. Think of that type of NBA talent. So even though Kansas does fit the profile, what can I say? I just simply can't do it with the Jayhawks. Does that make me biased? Absolutely. And I make no apologies for it whatsoever. And finally, I'm not going to go through all of my picks, of course. I'll just give you my 3 11 seed or higher upsets in the first round. I've got 13 seeded Yale over Texas A&M. Buzz Williams, I just think he's usually vulnerable, especially without that home whistle in particular. Plus, I'll be honest, my dad liked Yale. That was good enough for me. Also, I've got 11th-seeded North Carolina over Ole Miss. Of course, I had the benefit of seeing the Tar Heels, crush their opponent last night. And yes, I've got 2 SEC teams going down in the first round to upset. Apparently, I hate the SEC. Well, not so fast. I did have 2 and almost 3 SEC teams in the Final Four. And finally, this is the most obvious one on the slate. 12th-seeded Colorado State is actually a 1.5-point favorite over 5th-seeded Memphis over at FanDuel Sportsbook. So be aware of that at the very least. That's kind of an obvious pick, and if you're in an eliminator-style contest that gives you bonuses for the higher-seeded upsets you pick, kind of hard to go against Colorado State at the moment. And no matter what happens with the Tigers over the next week or two, well, the transfer portal in basketball is going to be open within the next couple of weeks or so. So people are already starting to think about it. Hey, what about Bennett Stirtz, Missouri's opponent on Thursday? Some fans, hey, he's from Liberty, Missouri, played at Northwest Missouri State. It's worth at least asking the question, could he be an option for the Tigers coming up? And also, why I think the calls of SEC bias in basketball are pretty stupid, to be honest with you. So let's get there. But first, I want to tell you about UpRock. Scaling your business requires the right expertise at the right time. With Upwork, you can find specialized freelancers in marketing, development, design, and more, experts ready to help take your business to the next level. And we're talking IT, AI, web development, marketing. Finding the right talent, always so important. Fast and easy hiring, cost-effective growth. Visit Upwork.com right now and post your job for free. That's UPWORK.com, Upwork.com, to connect with top talent and grow your business today. And life moves fast, especially when you have a family. One day you're watching your kids take their first steps, and before you know it, they are off to college. Well, that's why securing their future is so important. Fabric by Gerber Life makes it simple to get term life insurance that fits your family's needs. With Fabric, you can apply for term life insurance online right from your couch. Peace of mind, affordable coverage, beyond life insurance, by the way. Fabric also offers free digital wills and access to investment accounts to help you plan for your children's future. Join the thousands of patients who trust Fabric to help protect their families. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/lockedoncollege. That's meetfabric.com/lockedoncollege. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Assurance Company. Not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions. And believe me, folks, by going out on a limb here and picking Missouri to make history, to actually get to their first Final Four in program history, I realize I'm opening myself up to a lot of potential ridicule here, especially if the Tigers lose to Drake tomorrow. But you know what? As John Cena recently said, when someone is properly grounded in life, they shouldn't have to look outside themselves for approval. And you know what? I bet Bennett Stirtz probably feels that way as well. The young man who followed his coach, by the way, this season from Northwest Missouri State to Drake. Ben McCollum took Bennett Stirtz with him, and what a brilliant decision that was in both guys' first year with Drake. Obviously, Drake with 30 wins, Bennett Stirtz an enormous part of that. In fact, he's quite clearly the best player on their team, in my opinion. I would say a bona fide NBA prospect, in my opinion, after just one season of Division I basketball. Really, the only holes you can poke in any of his offensive game in particular, in my opinion, as well, he played against the Missouri Valley Conference. Let's see what he does against a higher level of basketball. And fair enough, I would just say that at 6'4", he's not exactly a guy that you're probably going to just isolate and pick on defensively constantly either. So he's a really interesting player, and I'd be enjoying the idea of watching him play in the first round a lot more if it wasn't against my Missouri Tigers. But one listener, I should say, Mike, writes in to say, John, heard you talk about Stirtz, and it's funny how he never got a chance to have any looks by Division I teams. How does this happen? This guy should have played for Missouri. Well, to the idea of how does it happen? Well, I don't know, to be honest with you. Teenagers are often unpredictable, number one, and they develop at certainly very different rates. I'll just say the NFL, by the way, can't even figure out the formula for identifying the best college football quarterback. So let's maybe cut college basketball coaches a little bit of slack on evaluating teenagers playing basketball. Plus, if you think about it, this is his junior year of basketball. So he was recruited in 2021, 2022 would have been when he would have been getting his most significant looks in high school basketball by especially Division I teams. They're looking at your junior year. Well, 2021, what was happening then? Oh, yes, COVID. COVID was the lockdowns, the restrictions, all this stuff. It really did kind of mess up college recruiting for a while in that, well, you just couldn't travel as much. You couldn't meet guys in person as much. Lots of coaches have talked about how that hampered their recruiting. I think COVID probably had a decent bit to do with it, but quite possibly Stirtz was just a late bloomer. I don't know. Or maybe the coaches all just made a horrific mistake. I would just say the idea that, well, he should have been at Mizzou, I don't think that's a legit criticism because he didn't have any Division I offers, period, as far as I can tell. You go to his recruiting profile in high school, and there's nothing there other than, hey, he committed to Northwest Missouri State, and then he transferred to Drake. There's nothing else out there that I can find. But as to this idea that Stirtz may hit the portal after this, hey, it's possible. It really is, because if you think about it, this could be his moment to cash in college basketball this offseason with an NIL opportunity that will certainly be six figures plus, more like I would say $500,000 plus, at least for a player of the caliber of Bennett Stirtz. So obviously Missouri would be interested if Stirtz hits the portal. The problem is, at least from Missouri's perspective, if you're a fan that would be interested in this young man, I think he's much more likely to go to the NBA than he is to the transfer portal. As we all know, hey, college basketball money is nice these days, but compared to NBA money, it's still a heck of a lot better in that league. So if you have a chance to worm your way into the association, you take it. There's no question about that, and I actually think Stirtz is that caliber of a player. He kind of reminds me a little bit of Austin Reeves, and I point him out because, well, Missouri played Austin Reeves in the first round of the NCAA tournament a few years ago too. Another guy who is Reeves, a little bit taller than Stirtz for sure, but guy who's not a true point guard, but certainly skilled enough to be your lead guard, lead your offense, that type of deal. I just think Stirtz is a really interesting player, and like Reeves, I think he's got a future at the NBA level. So if you were thinking Mizzou a possibility next season, hey, that sounds awesome. I just think he's more likely to take his talents to the pros than anything. Plus, I'll say this for Stirtz too. There's also there's a non-zero chance that Drake could make a run in this year's NCAA tournament, truly be the Cinderella story of the tournament. And if that happens, well, maybe there is some NIL money that the Drake alums can come up with, or just one particularly wealthy Drake alum in particular. That could certainly happen, and obviously the coach, Ben McCollum, showed a lot of belief and faith in Bennett Stirtz to take him from Northwest Missouri State to Drake. That could be a real special relationship there, and maybe under a special circumstances, Stirtz could come back for his senior season to Drake as well. I guess this is just another reason why I would say, hey, I know he's got Missouri ties, But ties to the University of Missouri, I'm not sure I'm seeing that at this point. And obviously, I've been a fan of an SEC program since 2011, but more obviously, I was a fan of a Big 12 program up until that moment. So I have a little bit of a different perspective than some SEC fans and some outsiders on how this conference is perceived. So what I'm saying is I do understand the frustration, especially on the SEC football side, the idea of bias, just the assumption that the conference is the best every season. But to see that trickle over to basketball this season, to the Danny Cannells of the world crying about bias with SEC basketball, I got to say, this one doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Let's talk about it and also some fake news about Missouri that's probably shown up in your Facebook feed recently. Let's talk about that in just a minute. But first, though, you ever check your bank account and wonder, where'd all my money go? Well, between dining out, online shopping, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in. And it's not just a budgeting app. Monarch Money is a complete financial command center with surprising insights like about how much you're spending on food delivery, for example. All in one convenience, no more juggling multiple apps, and it's easy to collaborate with a partner of your choosing as well. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONCollege for half off your first year. So first of all, I would just point out that in a world of, say, the Locked On Podcast Network, for example, and a bajillion other outlets out on the internet for sports content, I think the idea that ESPN, for instance, can just set the agenda for the rest of college basketball in particular, I think is kind of an old model of thinking, in particular when you consider how much is Stephen A. Smith on First Take talking about, well, SEC college basketball. It's just not that big of a mind share in sports media, in my opinion. I think the much more likely explanation, because for the last few years, the conventional wisdom has been that the Big 12 has been the best conference in college basketball. And I haven't really had a lot of strong arguments against that until this season, where to me it's quite clear that the SEC is the best conference in college basketball. And by the way, I'd argue the Big Ten is probably second right now. We can argue about that one way or the other, but there's no doubt that the ACC and the Big East are not even close to the SEC, by the way. And these are traditionally your East Coast, these are the teams that ESPN should want to pump up, right? UConn being right next door for another thing. But the reality is this season, the SEC is particularly good because, well, the teams who are traditionally really good in basketball, of course, Kentucky being the obvious one, Kentucky's quite good this season. So is Tennessee. So is Florida, who has won 2 national championships in its history. But then you've got teams like Auburn and Alabama, who, I'm telling you, 10 years ago, barely even cared about the sport. That may be a slight exaggeration, but not much. The amount that the interest has gone up just over the years with, of course, Nate Oates in the fold, even more so Bruce Pearl down in Auburn, you've just gotten so much more interest, so many more fans, so much more buy-in in those programs. And yes, those guys can coach, they can recruit. The quality of basketball is up. Plus, you had a 0-19 Missouri team, for example, last season. Well, that team suddenly is a force to be reckoned with. That's a team that has beaten the likes of Florida on the road. So, and Alabama at homes, and even teams like Georgia, Mississippi State, who are not typically thought of as basketball schools whatsoever, once the SEC network came along and all this new money started flooding into the coffers of SEC athletic departments, they decided pretty much collectively, well, we can't spend it all on football. I guess we better go spend some on basketball coaches too. And so far, over the years, that has paid off. This season has been, well, the culmination of that. And, of course, adding Texas and Oklahoma this year, a couple of tournament teams as well. You know, this is going to be an outlier season for the SEC, for sure. This is probably going to be the best season they have over the next decade or so collectively. But if you're upset that the SEC is taking a step up in college basketball, I would say get used to it. This is the new world order, for better or for worse. And speaking of the new world order, these days when I go on to my Facebook feed, I'm looking for pictures of my friends' kids and that kind of stuff. Well, let's see how their vacation was, that type of deal. And yet, these days, I'm being fed a bunch of absolute garbage on my Facebook feed. Often it's just clickbait nonsense about sports that's often just literal fake news. For example, I had my wife recently was going, "Hey, I heard Chase Daniel is gonna be on the Missouri coaching staff." I'm going, "What? Where in the world did you hear that?" Like, Chase is doing pretty good right now for Fox Sports. I mean, I didn't even have to look that one up. I immediately dismissed it. Then a few minutes later, threw Chase Daniel into the old Google machine. And, of course, nothing comes up about him being an assistant coach at Missouri. Same deal with my mother had asked me, like, "Hey, have you seen this new Netflix documentary on the Missouri Tigers?" Well, no, Mom, I have not. And don't you think maybe the guy who spends as much time as I do following Missouri Tigers football and basketball would have known that Netflix was producing a documentary? Do you think you might have heard that from your son before Facebook? And, Mom, I apologize if it sounds for my tone there. But really, I just need people to wake up a little bit on all this Facebook stuff. And not just Facebook. Almost anything you read on the internet, particularly on social media, there aren't really any guardrails these days, for better or for worse. So it's up to each one of us individually to go, wait a second, does this actually make sense? The old adage of, hey, you can't believe everything you read, that's been around for centuries. That's been around long before the internet and social media, but it's never, ever, ever been more relevant than it is right now. Everything you read on the internet, unless it's from an absolute source that you trust, whatever that might be, again, you're going to have to use your judgment here, people. The bottom line here, you can't believe anything you read on Facebook or on social media without double checking it first. So if you see some Missouri rumor that you think is just too crazy to believe, or you think, wow, how has John not talked about this yet? There's probably a good reason for that. So let's all get a little bit better at media recognition and media consumption. There's the word that I was searching for in vain there. But hey, thanks for joining me here on Locked On Mizzou. Of course, after Missouri's game against Drake tomorrow, I'll have a quick post-game for you, and then probably a bigger and more in-depth recap of the game on Friday morning as well. And of course, the Tigers win. Going to have to talk about the second round as well. So until then, I am John Miller. Thanks for listening to Locked On Mizzou.